to the degree that you want something is the degree you're afraid of not having.
Yeah. God, I wish I started when I was younger. I go, well, yeah, but you didn't. So shut the fuck up and let's keep going.
Right.
Like, you can't.
Nobody changes until they change their energy. And when you change your energy, you change your life. Because it's not till then that it's really real.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is way worse than I thought. It's like, oh yeah, it's way, way worse than you thought.
Yeah.
But luckily, there's more to you than you think.
Jon and Jon. What's up, guys? This has been an illuminating conversation as we've been getting ready for this podcast. So we're just going to dive right in. But for people listening, since you're both named Jon, why don't you just give a brief intro of yourself so people can hear your voice and associate that voice with who the fuck you are?
Yeah. Howdy. So I am Jon 1, I guess. We could assign
Jon 1.
We could assign variables like scientists. I'm Jon 1, and so pleasure to be here. So I'm a dude from Ohio, and then did my undergrad in chemistry there, and then played in a band for a while, and then actually finished the undergrad in chemistry, and then shot over to the University of Michigan to do my master's and my PhD in physiology. And now I'm a postdoc, which means I'm in like grade 27 or something like that, out at UCSD, where I'm studying mindfulness meditation and psychedelics for chronic pain and promotion of empathy and compassion.
Beautiful. And Jon 1 is named Jon Dean, for anybody who wants to mix the correlation.
And you want to add his
I'm
last name.
already confusing people.
I know, man. I'm Jon number 2, John Chavez, founder of DMT Quest, a nonprofit dedicated to publicizing the results of all endogenous DMT research, as well as fundraising for the cause, because it's an underfunded field, and I feel it's one of the most important fields to study.
So the reason you guys are both here is because I got forwarded the documentary DMT Quest from Wim Hof, who's featured in the DMT Quest, and he was like, "You guys, you got to check this out. It's right up your alley," and it absolutely was right up my alley. And what was really interesting immediately to me, there was a lot of interesting, things presented in the documentary. But what was immediately interesting is that I somehow managed to miss the significance of the study that you published in 2019 that was showing endogenous activity of DMT in the brain. And this is something that's been highly contested and debated, and is still somewhat contested and debated in certain levels, but you actually showed something at significant enough levels where at least the baseline question, is there DMT endogenously produced in the mammalian brain, that has unequivocally been answered.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, that was the goal of the study. I mean, so it all started in like 2013, where Jimo Borgigan, who was the senior author on that paper at the University of Michigan, she was collaborating with a gentleman named Steve Barker, who's an analytical chemist, and then also Rick Strassman, who has been involved in the DMT research field and really blowing the door off of psychedelic research again in the 90s to where we are today. So they collaborated on a paper. I guess the big thing that was contested prior to that study and then our 2019 study was it's been known for decades that there's trace amounts of DMT in mammalian bodily fluids like urine, blood, even cerebrospinal fluid. They found it in certain studies. But a lot of those techniques were a little bit older analytical methods. And so what we kind of set out to do was look directly in the brain in rats. And that 2013 study found DMT in the living rat brain. So the way that you do that is you can actually like probe the brain non-invasively. So the rats are fine and they're just moving around like they normally would. And you're sampling the fluid from the brain, and then you can look for any compound you want to that you can detect molecularly with analytical chemistry techniques. And what we found was in the 2013 study, what Jimo and Rick and Steve found was that there was DMT in the living pineal gland for the very first time. So that was exciting enough that Jimo started to follow that up. And when I came on board, we just asked a simple question. One is DMT. So can we quantify it? Can we look at the levels and compare it to known neurotransmitters that are established in those brain areas? And so we looked at a comparison between DMT and serotonin, which serotonin is one of the major neurotransmitters that is established to have a role in mood and several other things, several other...
Potentially hundreds of different functions in the brain.
Yeah, exactly. And so the real strength of that study was we found DMT in concentrations that were comparable to serotonin, so about half of serotonin in the rat visual cortex. And then one of the other things we did was looked at rats that we didn't sample from the pineal gland anymore, but the area surrounding the pineal gland, because that was like a controversy too. Can the pineal gland really produce this much DMT, et cetera, et cetera? So what we found was when we sampled from the visual cortex alone, we still saw DMT, suggesting that although it looks like the pineal gland's producing DMT, it's not necessary for DMT production. And then there were some other things we could talk about, but that's the main finding in the paper.
What was the reason that because normally DMT is not considered a neurotransmitter, and I guess we should take one back step and describe for people what DMT is, but you were starting to compare it to a neurotransmitter with somewhat of a hypothesis, which is something that's presented in the film, that DMT acts similar to a neurotransmitter, potentially to the point where it could qualify as a neurotransmitter. But this is revolutionary thinking here, right? This isn't what DMT was thought to be earlier than that, right? So first, let's take a quick back step and describe, what is DMT? What did people used to think it was? And then what did you guys, ultimately think of as an alternate hypothesis for what DMT is and how it's acting in the brain?
Sure. So we could take it way back to like the 50s, honestly, because psychopharmacology, the whole field is kind of really founded on the idea that psychedelics, like classical psychedelics like LSD, modulate the serotonin system in large part because their chemical structure is similar to serotonin.
So fitting in these 5-HT2 receptor
exactly.
sites, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that connection kind of blew the door off of what we know as modern pharmacology. And the fact that DMT is very similar in chemical structure to serotonin was always very intriguing. But I think the main studies that it was much harder to find a trace on DMT in bodily fluids. So that's why by us looking directly in the brain, there was no like metabolic breakdown process. Like we were sampling right from the source of where we'd anticipated to see DMT based on the gene activity that the genes that are known to synthesize DMT in the brain, or in the body, I should say, because we found them in the brain together for the first time in that study in the rats. So placing the gene activity with the concentrations of DMT that were comparable to serotonin, I think that kind of like took us to where we are with it today. But we still haven't really shown yet, and I know that they're working on that at the University of Michigan. That's because, like I said, I'm out at UCSD now. But so just finding it in those levels doesn't necessitate that it's a neurotransmitter per se. So they're doing some studies looking at things.
But it opens the door that it could be.
Yeah, it certainly does. Yeah.
It opens because the amount. So basically, the amount that you were able to show, what makes it so that it's no longer this artifact that's in trace amounts, that's negligible, but it's in significant enough amounts that it may play a role of significant equivalence to a neurotransmitter like acetylcholine or serotonin or
Correct.
GABA or one of these other things.
Exactly.
What do you, John, think, because you're not bound by the rigors of academia to
God, man.
to speak very carefully about these things. What do you think this is showing about what DMT actually is doing? And John, feel free to jump in too.
I mean, it's pretty clear reality is a hallucination, right? I mean, if we had psilocybin or LSD floating around in our brains at, similar concentrations of DMT, you would say that somebody was probably tripping. So, I mean, the fact that we're producing DMT at similar levels of serotonin, that leads me to believe that, maybe the reality is somewhat of a simulation to a certain extent, right? Like, I think that reality is a little bit more malleable. I think the fact that DMT is produced, the interesting thing is that you guys cite the rat aspect of the study, but you guys also looked at in vitro slices of human brains, right? To look at the machinery, the enzymes to show that the human actually have the enzymes to produce DMT throughout the brain as well, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, because I think that's one of the criticisms of the study was that it was only a rat study, but it actually wasn't just a rat study. It was actually partially human brain sampling as well. So I think that needs to be cited pretty clearly for the public to understand that it wasn't just a rat study. This does translate to humans, and it seems as though DMT plays a key role in just modulating our everyday waking reality. And since we're producing a hallucinogen, I mean, I think it's a natural kind of conversation to really question how malleable this reality is, and just some of the experiences that we have. It's a tricky conversation. I think DMT has largely been correlated with near-death experiences, dream states, but the study that they came out with kind of just changes the whole conversation altogether. That this whole thing is pretty much a hallucinatory experience to a certain extent.
Well, and hallucinatory is a loaded word, being that hallucination may mean it's not real, right? But it actually could be. Everything could be real, and that's the interesting part is like this could actually be building reality.
Either everything's real or nothing's real, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So that's an interesting just kind of note to make. And ultimately through my own spiritual exploration, when I hear simulation, a lot of times people talk about, some advanced civilization put some kind of computer program together and we're living in this computer program. That's not in my reality sphere and my timeline of what the possibility is. But the simulation to me is that we are a perspective in the mind of God, right? Like this is all the mind of God and we're just a perspective. So the simulation is that this is mind. Everything is mind everything is capital M mind. And so to think that like our mind is just a perspective on the capital M mind. So how we're navigating this mind, okay, you can call that a simulation. And so for me, that's personally my way of understanding this simulation theory is not that, there's some, people looking at our, little computer program and chuckling as they, sip on our excretion fluids in the matrix or whatever the fuck is going on.
Yeah.
But like that this is actually built into the construct of the universe itself as participatory perspectives in this universal capital M mind.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I guess, in terms of some of the concepts that we believe are based on upregulating DMT. Does that allow us to tap into the mind of God or connect with God in a certain way, or connect with like supernormal abilities, like my man Wim Hof, your friend as well? These are the things that I'm really interested in. Not just the basics, but also the outliers, the stuff that is really going to move the needle in terms of society changing in the future and really tapping into the human potential.
Yeah. What the DMT has for anybody who's experienced it, ayahuasca, mimosa, there's a variety of different ways. Yahe, there's is that the one that you snuff? This is the one that you snuff. Yopo.
Yeah, Yopo.
Yopo. Yahe is another word for ayahuasca. But whatever, there's a variety of ways that you can get NN-DMT in, and anybody who's experienced it in any one of these ways, ayahuasca and smoking DMT is probably the most common. It's a really unique experience in the pantheon of psychedelics. It's doing something that's different. So from just a materialist, reductionist standpoint, what is happening when you actually take exogenous DMT that's different from when you take psilocybin or when you take, LSD or something like that?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question for sure. From the science perspective anyways. Yeah, it's right. It's like how can something that more or less binds the same main receptor, 5-HT2A, to have these effects? I think we're sort of in a facile stage of understanding that. It's like, so to kind of go in with the conversation that y'all were just having, to me, one of the really interesting things about endogenous DMT and one of the potential roles for it is in visual perception. Mm-hmm. So in that study, we found high gene activity in the neurons in the visual cortex of the rats for the biosynthetic DMT enzymes. And we also found DMT in those areas comparable to serotonin.
And you said in the eye genes?
So in the visual cortex, in the neurons of the rat visual cortex is where we were mainly looking in that study. And we basically found a very strong presence of endogenous DMT in that brain area. Since exogenous DMT is such a very powerful visual, at least NN experience, to me, there's some overlap that would be very interesting to pursue from the basic science standpoint of maybe endogenous DMT is playing some sort of role in just mediating visual processing in the brain. So I think that's a really cool, foundational question to start probing. And in terms of, so this is a little more speculative, but we're starting to sort of nip at this. And I know at UMich this is happening, and I'm pushing forward at UCSD too, is looking at what psychedelics may do to the endogenous DMT system. So is it that when you take something like psilocybin, is it maybe having an effect on the DMT that's being naturally produced in your body in some way, shape, or form? And is maybe that a point of convergence for all psychedelics that you take, right?
That would be really interesting, because then what you're saying is, if I could sum and make sure that I'm saying this correctly, but if DMT is involved in modulating what we're able to see, and psychedelics are creating these, visionary experiences, perhaps they're all tying in to the DMT mechanism, which is allowing us access to these non-ordinary visionary states.
It very well could be. And again, we were talking about this a little bit earlier before we mic'd up. Just the idea that it's not that far-fetched if you think about endogenous systems that are already in place that have mind-altering properties to them. You look at endogenous opioids, right? There's a reason that when you take a pill that is designed for pain relief, that it gives you pain relief in the sense that it binds to receptors and it engages the endogenous opioid system. Same thing with cannabis. There's a whole system mediating when someone smokes cannabis or however they take it. When you ingest cannabis, there's a whole endogenous cannabinoid system that is interacting with that to produce that effect on not only consciousness, but the physiological effects as well. So it's not, in my mind, that far-fetched to think that maybe endogenous DMT could be playing some sort of mediating role, and maybe not even just with psychedelics, but things that are similar like SSRIs, et cetera. So I think that's, from a scientific perspective, is where it gets interesting and more fundable when you think about what now psychedelics are really becoming mainstay, right? I mean, they're being publicly traded now, right? So, so if you are asking the question of how can we better understand mental states or aberrant mental states or people's emotional dysfunction, or I hate that word, but you get my point.
Right.
So looking at that potential possibility for endogenous DMT, I think is an interesting way to go.
It's, this is something that Wim Hof says all the time, we are our own endogenous pharmacy, we're able to produce all of these different things. You want to produce opioids, you want to produce cannabinoids, you want to produce DMT, you want to produce any of these things. There's methods. He recommends the breath work, which was actually shown to actually modulate DMT, at least in particular, and probably all of these things, right? The Wim Hof method has shown
a little bit inadvertently, in the sense where we tied in, basically the studies that I've looked at in terms of EEG and ayahuasca and DMT and 5-MeO DMT. It seems to be a pretty consistent signature of alpha suppression and a gamma spike, and we saw that with the Wim Hof, at least that one pilot. And currently, we're actually doing more extensive EEG with Wim Hof, and it seems to be rather consistent that you see a similar signature to the DMT and ayahuasca study. So it's not a direct DMT, I guess, extraction in terms of the Wim Hof method, but it seems correlatory for sure.
Yeah, so it's correlating to the different changes that you see from an EEG.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the one thing we got to remember is that in Rick Strassman's study in the early 1990s, he had 4 different levels of DMT that it administered to people. 2 of them were sub-psychedelic, meaning that there was no visionary experiences. And at the lowest level, it modulated mood, where people were describing it as heroin, almost like euphoric, just from DMT. So, we have to recognize the fact that, not everything DMT related is going to be so visionary. Some things are a little bit more subtle. And that's where I think especially the Wim Hof method correlates with a DMT sort of experience at the lower levels, because the euphoric experience is very consistent. And I think that's probably a little bit more closer to what we're looking at.
Strassman, he saw some rapid eye movements in there too.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
Yeah, so it's correlation potentially to sleep.
can't we just observe anymore in science? Must we break it down to the individual photon?
Says the scientist.
Yeah.
Says the fucking scientist. Well, I mean, it's something that Sadhguru said. I totally disagree with him on his take on psychedelics, but from his perspective, he's like, I don't know what everybody wants psychedelics for. I'm high all the fucking time. That's why I'm wearing sunglasses. You know, he's like he was quite confident that he could produce whatever state that somebody else was looking for externally, he could produce it internally. You listen to Ram Dass lectures, and he's talking about the same thing that he's activating in meditation that I would describe in the most intense blast off, DMT experience, either with ayahuasca or mimosa or whatever. So it seems like there's certain outliers who've been able to at least, functionally for themselves create these experiences that mimic what the subjective experience of somebody who's taking a strong psychedelic would be.
Yeah, I mean, that's been pretty consistent with if people are long-term meditators, the EEG, they basically walk in and they're exuding much higher gamma than the average. So, I mean, it kind of makes sense. Interesting.
Yeah, the overlap with psychedelics and meditation that's something I'm super interested in too. There's not a lot out there on it, but at UCSD, they're pretty poised to start integrating meditation into the psilocybin sessions and things like that. I think that's really exciting work.
Yeah, for sure.
That could really help a lot of people as we sort of blow the doors off integrating this into the clinic, to really help them get through that experience and come out on the other side much better for it.
Yeah. Joe Dispenza's done a lot of EEG work with his top meditators, and all of the experiences with entities and beings, and even, he talks about full-on Monroe Institute level paranormal experiences, people being able to read the backside of a chalkboard on the other side of the room. People, all of these things were associated with extraordinarily high gamma. Not like high gamma from what you see in the textbook, but like in the thousands and tens of thousands high gamma, right? Like these extraordinarily high gamma states are always correlative to that. And then, I just recently read Jamie Wheel's book, Recapture the Rapture. He's talking about the slow 1 hertz delta, also a waking delta, also being a really interesting unicity experience too. And so it seems like basically whatever you're experiencing subjectively is going to be tied to a variety of different things, potentially neurochemically, neurobiologically, and then through your brainwave states as well. Like you're going to be able to track what you're experiencing to some change in the body.
Well, to go back to your earlier comment about what do exogenous psychedelics do, are you familiar with Chris Timmerman's work from Imperial College? Okay, yeah, check his stuff out. It's really, really, really pioneering sort of basic foundational science of understanding what DMT specifically does. That's his main focus. But a study put out, I believe it was in the same year we put out our Endo-DMT paper, 2019, and in the same journal, he showed that exogenous DMT will give you this like theta REM sleep like increase and this like drop in alpha. So there's like a lot of overlap with basically what the visions that people were having on that sort of correlated potentially with something like REM sleep, where you also are seeing things and your brain's actually under the impression that, hey, this is
real.
This is what's happening. This is just different, but it's being perceived the same way.
I mean, it's a little different than dreams. I once, and please, for people, feel free to dream analyze this, I suppose. I was going to tell you not to. But anyways, I had a dream the other day that I had to go to the bathroom and I had to take a shit, and there was nowhere to take a shit. And all I had was like a frozen yogurt, like a soft serve cone type of situation. And I had to shit in it. And I was like, and it was too much for the thing. So it was like spilling all over my hand. And it was this like moment of like, what is going on? How did I get in this situation? Okay. So the reason I'm bringing that up is that's a dream. And maybe it's modulated by this, but you don't seem to have those those visions on ayahuasca. At least I haven't yet. I don't know, maybe my next time.
I'm proud of us. We made it 45 minutes without a fart joke. We're doing good, guys.
So it seems like it is that, but it seems like there's also a way that it's not that. You know what I mean? Like there's something that's happening in the brain with dreams that can be totally random. And sometimes I've had dreams that were similar. I'm not saying that, I've had encounters in dreams that were very interesting, and dreams that I wake up and I'll write them down like, holy shit, that was very similar to what I could experience on ayahuasca. And I actually told that dream recently. There's a really potent dream like that, not involving shit. And like, but there's other ones that seem just completely random. And that doesn't seem to happen in kind of like a DMT experience.
The science is very correlative, so yeah, duly noted. When you look at like dream, what's really known about dream sleep in terms of neurochemistry, and so I mean, I kind of cut my teeth on neurochemistry because there's also like a lot of changes in brain activity and how the brain communicates. But that's kind of the things I'm starting to really get into now, learning like fMRI, et cetera, in my postdoc. But in terms of neurochemistry, like acetylcholine levels are very elevated during REM sleep and also during wake. So there was a really cool study looking at, I think it was, they took like the Erowid vault, if you're familiar with the Erowid site. They just took the vault of a bunch of different psychedelics and compounds, and they just sort of data mined it and correlated different words with different compounds. And then they did a cross-examination with NDE. And then they created this whole thing looking at like the overlap between which compounds would be sort of the highest on the list of. So I think it was DMT was like third, if I remember correctly. Like it's like ketamine's up there, and then there's DMT, and also cannabis was pretty high up there. So there's a lot of caveats to that study. Mm-hmm. But point being is, if you think of something like an NDE, I mean, there's, again, I'm a firm believer that there's going to be a biological imprint for pretty much anything that you're experiencing. Right. But with the whole like DMT correlating to NDE thing, I think it's an NDE is probably, neurochemically speaking, a much larger picture than just like one compound, right? And that study kind of speaks to that. And there are neurotransmitters that are altered by other psychedelics, like ketamine is like more glutamatergic than DMT, which is more serotonergic, et cetera. And then you get into things like salvia. I think that was pretty high up there too. And that's like a whole nother thing, mechanistically speaking. So
stay away from salvia.
Yeah, I have no interest, except for that Hamilton Morris thing where they were rolling the leaves in water and chewing them and not smoking it. Did you see that one?
No, what happened?
So it's like there's a traditional salvia preparation where, because right now you smoke it and it comes in little packets. And I remember the most hilarious packet I saw was a packet that said panic. And it just had someone clawing out their face. And I was like, why would you buy this? Like, but thank you for letting us all know what the intention of this particular compound was panic. But nonetheless, like what fucking sicko wants to do that?
And it's like sitting next to the Marlboros. Like, so it's like let's pay attention to regulation and drug education for sure.
Yeah. Do we want the panic today, or do we want to go with something a little easier? But this preparation was rolled leaves, and you chew the leaves, and you chew the leaves, and I think you either swallow or form like a wad in your mouth, and that seemed like a pretty interesting experience. But as we know, different things interact differently depending on the preparation. Like 5-MeO, so bufo, the frog, it is a frog toxin that comes from the Bufo alvarius, and they actually reclassified that toad recently. But if you had it just in its raw state, like if you just drank it, it would be highly toxic. But when you smoke it, it deactivates the toxins, and then you get the 5-MeO DMT experience, which in my mind is the strongest psychedelic experience in the world, bar none.
Mike Tyson agrees.
Yeah, Mike Tyson does agree. But so it's possible that what the problem is with salvia is just that everybody's doing it wrong.
Yeah, it's possible.
It's my theory on salvia. But anyways, I don't know how you get salvia leaves, and definitely I agree with you. Stay away from panic. That's not the way you want to go. But since I opened the door to 5-MeO DMT, what is the difference between NN-DMT and 5-MeO DMT, and what do you know about how it interacts differently? Because subjectively, the experience is pretty dramatically different.
Yeah, so I mean, from a receptor, like pharmacology, neurochemical perspective, there are some subtle differences in terms of like affinity at 5-HT2A. I believe it's a little more potent, so it'll definitely trigger whatever the mechanism is downstream a little bit easier. And then just chemically, it's really only a small tweak to the compound. So the 5 points to like this part of the ring that has this methoxy group on it, which is literally just like some carbon, hydrogen, and an oxygen. So they're very similar, but ethanol and methanol are also very similar, right? And I mean, I know what I'm drinking later. Like, we were at a cool brewery last night, though, that might have had some methanol out there. Yeah.
I'm feeling kind of floaty today. Let me ask you a question, though. This is important because a lot of people describe, I've never done 5. I've only heard about it. I'm just being straight up honest, is that the 5 is less visionary than the regular DMT. But in that Barker study where he gave LSD to rats, and then they did, I don't know if it was cerebral spinal fluid sampling of the rats, and they actually saw 1,000% increase in endogenous 5-MeO DMT and a 400% increase in regular DMT. And LSD is obviously a pretty visionary experience. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of Barker's whole hypothesis, I think. I'm pretty sure he came up with that in the 80s, that there's this endo-DMT system that is being... I'm very interested in that.
I can speak to that specifically because I've taken a compound called Vilca with Don Howard, and Vilca is a combination. It was his own mixture of 5-MeO DMT and NN-DMT simultaneously, and in that mixture, the experience is extraordinarily visual. Like visions, like you're completely immersed in an alternate reality, which can happen in an NN experience or an ayahuasca experience, but not to this level. It was the most extreme visionary experience I've ever had, and I've done it, I don't know, 4 times or something like that with him, and the strongest. Then Vilca comes from a seed pod that has both, but there's different ways you can mix the seed pod, and he had the old Chavez recipe from a long time ago, and you snort it out of an old Chavez shaman finger bone from 3,000 years. Fucking epic, this whole experience. And you snort, the whole thing is like this whole thing, and he always had this joke, you snort until it feels like a railroad spike went up your nose. Like you have at it, and you go in and have this experience, and you're gone in this other world. Now, that said, I've had many, many 5-MeO journeys and worked with the Siri elders and the Siri tribe who've kind of initiated me in that practice. I have never once had a single visual experience on, no matter how heavy the dose, no matter how frequent the dose, no matter how light the dose, on 5-MeO alone. I've not had one. Now, other people have. I'm not, there's certainly cases in which that happens. So it seems to me, my own, N of 1, is that for me, 5-MeO is not correlative to any kind of visual modulation at all. It's completely somatic. It's like every cell of my body turns into everything in the universe, bursting with the only thing that you could describe as God or capital L love.
Yeah.
My last experience, that's just what I was yelling over and over again, even though it's my, 40th experience. It was, wow, God, wow. Like and it's indescribable as anything else. And there's no other sights or sounds or colors or anything. It's just a complete unicity experience. So I would say, and if I was going to continue, and I'll certainly open this up for you guys to dive in, but what it seems to me is if you looked at this from a map of where something is going to land you and land your brain and tune your radio, and I want to talk about the brain as well. In a 9-dimensional reality, which is something proposed by both Matthias DeStefano, who's someone I want to have on the podcast, really interesting for those of you who want to dive in. He has a show on Gaia called Initiations, which mimics what a lot of the South American shamans have talked about almost exactly, which is just different realms of the astral that you can gain access to. And there's the realms of the fourth through the 8th dimension, which can be very visual and have different encounters with beings that all represent, something of articulation from the source. But then there's the 9th or the 1st dimension, which is different expressions of the unicity, of the all, of that point in the universe, the Big Bang, when, astrophysicists presume that everything was condensed down to the size of a thumbnail, maybe a pinprick, maybe a single atom of pure potential energy and light, of oneness, of absolute oneness, and then it blows out into articulation and matter, thought, and everything happens from there. My hypothesis from my own experience would be that 5-MeO is the bridge to either, and I think the 1st and the 9th, they all kind of meet up. It's like a circle where they both go out in that different realm. It brings you to that state, the unicity state, whereas NN typically, well, potentially it has the power to get you there, but typically it's going to land you somewhere in the optimal brain state, the radio receiver state, to access a, typically probably fifth through, because fourth is just time, but like fifth through eighth dimensional access, which is what my hypothesis would be if I accept the premise of the 9-dimensional map. And that seems to explain things to me the best that I can possibly explain it.
Yeah, I'm super curious about the role of endogenous 5-MeO. I just happen to think that, your study was super groundbreaking, but if we delve into the 5-MeO aspect, that's going to add even more to that conversation, Just because 5-MeO is considered, like you said, the most powerful psychedelic out there. And if we're producing it at comparable levels to serotonin, that's pretty wild. It would be pretty wild if we found that.
It would be. That's why the visual stuff is just finding out what's going on, just like at a baseline level with this stuff, is to me the most fundamental question to answer going forward, to start tying in some of these much more exciting and speculative but more grander implications of what is reality, et cetera, right? But for me, like I said, just seeing if there's some correlation or some functional role for it in vision. And then like Nick Linos, a colleague at the University of Michigan, has been working on just establishing it as a neurotransmitter. Because again, just finding it in the levels we found, it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have to function as a neurotransmitter. So can this molecule actually be like packaged into storage vesicles, and is there a mechanism in place for it to be taken up and into the neurons and stored there for future release? Like all these things that like quantify something as a neurotransmitter. Mm-hmm. Those are sort of the foundational science questions to go for. But 5-MeO is, from my review of all that literature, there's way less out there on it in terms of like endogenous. Some studies have found it for sure. But I think it's something, again, to me, all these conversations are important with these indolamines, these compounds that look like DMT, that have exogenous administration will like impact your consciousness or your mental health, especially in the era where we're starting to administer these compounds to people to try to help them through their rough times. Like understanding how it interacts with the body is going to be really a big piece of that.
Sure.
To navigate the realm safely.
Is it weird to you that we've spent all of these billions and billions of dollars trying to explore outer space, but it's like hard to get a couple $100,000 or $1 million to study how the fucking brain works?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I don't get too wrapped up in that stuff. I mean, it's a grind for sure, right? But I feel like a lot of that just like falls on the scientist to just be able to put something together that's really concrete, that's rational, that definitely has a reach out to public health, which this clearly now is becoming. Or even the conversation that we had earlier about like kids being able to walk into a gas station and get a hold of something that could potentially go very, very wrong for them. And just having an education system in place, I think, is huge. So sort of reforming how we interact with the general public as a society, with reshaping our relationship to these compounds and making sure that people are educated in like how they use them. I think that's my biggest fear too, like moving into this space and starting to work in the realm of like, we're doing a study for phantom limb pain, so psilocybin for phantom limb pain, because there's been some interesting case studies of the phantom limb pain being pretty much taken care of with a strong dose of psilocybin, coupled with this thing called mirror therapy, where they sort of put a mirror sagittal to the limb that's intact. And then when the participant sees a limb where there was not the presence of a limb before, it'll actually alleviate the pain. So we're thinking that combining those two things together, so the psychedelics have been shown to sort of increase the way the brain's visual and like sensory motor areas communicate with one another, and that's kind of what the mirror therapy is doing too. It's basically synesthesia. It's really, really interesting. I'm excited about that project. But again, I mean, to me, like having real conversations, like I hope that that's where we're progressing, especially now that there's hundreds of millions of dollars being dumped into this. Like, so just that it keeps people's mental health proper, because like not everybody, this isn't going to work for everybody, right? Like psychedelic therapy. And the people that it does work for, you know, that it may be, especially somebody that's naive to it, it's going to be a long road ahead, right? So it's like just making sure that we're not trying to present it as too much of a panacea. Maybe I diverged a little bit there, but
we all do.
Yeah.
No, it's an important message, though. You know, I mean, I think it's an important message that can't be overstated. As I think with the excitement around it, people can just rush out to go have this experience. You know, you could have heard me describe 5-MeO and be like, where do I get it? How do I do it? And let me smoke as much as I can. Like, please don't.
I like it.
I'm not even fucking recommending it. You know, like there's some really challenging experiences. My, you know, dear brother, best friend, Kyle Kingsbury, you know, he's an experienced psychonaut, had a 5-MeO journey that was real rough. Months of integration work, you know, where there's reactivations every time he would go to sleep. Like, you know, it's an incredibly potent experience, and it's you know, it's something to be mindful of.
Yeah. And like the big pharma coming in, it's just I mean, you know, there's a lot of good people working in every space. So who am I to judge anyone, right? Or anyone's motives. But yeah, you know, you got like Ibogaine Twizzlers and Chonga gumballs. Depressed, get yourself
I would sign the fuck
MEO
up.
snow cone.
Yeah, where are they? Because put a little fucking bell on the little car that goes around. I will buy one of those right away. Ibogaine Twizzlers. Let's go.
Oh no, what did I just? Yeah. Oh boy.
I do think it is a problem, though, that endogenous DMT and the whole endogenous hallucinatory system, because we actually produce monoamine oxidase inhibitors, multiple ones. I think tribulin, penylene, neurocatin, Harmon. Like, there hasn't been enough money put into study like the endowaska system. And I think that's the question that you're asking earlier is like, not even $1 million in the past 20 years has gone into studying this system, you know, endogenously. And I think that's a disgrace to understanding the human experience a little bit better. You know, I emailed J.C. Calloway. He had published a hypothesis paper in, I believe, 1988, thinking that DMT and penylene correlated with the dream state. And I asked him, did you ever follow that hypothesis up with a study? And he said there wasn't any funding. And then I speak with Jima Borjigan at University of Michigan, you know, asking her, you know, can we do this study or that study? And she's like, there's not any funding. And this has been going on for decades. So I think...
So you're talking about MAOIs.
MAOIs, yeah. The body produces MAOIs. Absolutely.
Right. And so the endogenous production of MAOIs, which may modulate the available amount of these other compounds, like potentially endogenous DMT, because that's how it works
with
in the
ayahuasca.
body. Like the reason why DMT trips are so short when you smoke it is if you smoke it, it's really short because it floods your body, and very quickly MAOI clears it from the system. And
the MAO clears it from the system.
MAO, yeah. MAO, monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So if you have an inhibitor, it inhibits the MAO from clearing it from the system.
Yeah.
And then in ayahuasca, it's not actually technically an MAOI, but it acts in the same way to make it basically orally available for, you know, I don't know, 6, 8, 10 hours.
Yeah.
Whatever that is. So this is an interesting way. And then if you do something like anahuasca, which is Syrian rue and psilocybin, which you're adding an MAOI, so you're suppressing MAO and then taking it with psilocybin, it has a dramatically different quality to it. I mean, very much more like an ayahuasca experience, which is interesting, different, but...
You've done that before?
I've done that before, yeah.
Is there a purge effect as well?
Yes, but not in the same way. There wasn't a purge through nausea. There was a heavy sweat purge that actually needed, and a movement purge. Like I was almost like a shivering basically, but intentionally shivering to the point that I would start sweating and moving. And like I had to get energy and I had to get stuff out of my system. So, you know, if you talk to the ayahuasca shamans, there's many ways to purge. You can purge through breath, you can purge through tears, you can purge through vomit, you can purge through shit, you can purge through sweat, you can purge through any variety of ways. I think there's a variety of different ways to purge. So was there a purge? Yes, absolutely. But was it the same as ayahuasca? No, it wasn't. Though the visions, I was in the jungle, which was interesting because I've never done ayahuasca. I mean, I've never done psilocybin and been in the jungle scape, but that's frequent experience on ayahuasca, right? So it was interesting how it kind of took me to a similar, one of the reasons why potentially it's called ayahuasca. But the point being that, MAOI plus any psychedelic is going to create an interesting effect.
Yeah.
There's an interesting way that this is going to interact. And it's not just with, DMT.
Yeah, and I've heard you have to be really careful combining monoamine oxidase inhibitors with 5-MeO. I think that's why it's a really interesting conversation endogenously, because it would lead me to speculate that you need like very low levels of 5-MeO, and maybe you have elevated levels of MAOI that are causing, some of these spiritual experiences or things like that. So hopefully in the future, we could see some studies that really tie it all in, where it's not, big props to you, John, for getting the DMT stuff out. But if we could find a way to kind of, include MAOI and 5-MeO with the DMT and see like the cascade effect, if there's a fluctuation in all these chemicals, it'd give us a better perspective of what's going on.
Something big is getting a trace on them in human fluids.
Yeah.
That's been difficult, which the rat study was a way to circumvent the issue of how rapidly DMT is degraded in the periphery.
Right.
So having a technique where you can get an accurate read on a DMT signal, even if it's not super quantitative in terms of like, it's this amount of DMT and we're sure of it, because that stuff kind of fluctuates and you have to, in my opinion, take averages of multiple studies to really kind of see where it sits.
And measuring MAO is similarly difficult to measuring DMT, or just people haven't done it?
So I'm saying, well, you're measuring, you could measure sort of enzymatic activity, yeah, and that's not as difficult, but to sort of link it to the experiential portion of things, I would be. But I just mean just finding a way to be able to, in the human living brain, I think is where it's at. That's
Right.
going to be, and that's like one of my long-term career goals is working toward imaging DMT in the human brain, and
Non-invasive.
yeah, well,
Yeah,
That would take a hell of a volunteer.
that's a big one, man. That's a big real. If that happens, that's a game changer, John. I hope that happens.
Well, to go and to just follow up on this point, though, let's assume that there's a baseline level of all of these compounds endogenously in the brain. So there's a baseline level of DMT, for example. What may be happening in a lot of these different experiences is a modulation of MAO and in some way, and that's actually allowing the relatively stable levels of DMT to actually become more available in the brain and more active in the brain. I mean, this is how, we have our flagship products, the nootropic, and the nootropic, one of the core ingredients in it is Huperzia serrata, which has a compound huperzine A, B, and C, which is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. So acetylcholinesterase is what breaks down acetylcholine in the brain. So by inhibiting acetylcholinesterase, you have a more available acetylcholine in the brain, and that's what we were able to show in our clinical research, is creating the effects that alpha brain has, increase in focus and short-term memory and a variety of different things that we showed with the Boston Center for Memory. But it's the same idea, right? Like, it's not that we're adding any more new stuff, and what we do actually in the formula, but that compound works because it's just stopping the thing that's naturally breaking down what the body's producing anyways.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting way to look at what might be happening on a day-to-day basis when somebody's having one of these experiences. Maybe the brain's not all of a sudden producing a whole bunch more DMT when you have that abduction experience and you feel like you fucking got lifted up in a spaceship. Maybe something happened to your MAO system.
Yeah.
And that's what created the surplus of DMT. So
Yeah.
really interesting to study. Like, both of those things could explain the phenomenon that we're trying to target.
Yeah, I've actually seen some studies where I think stress is upregulates DMT, right? Have you seen some studies like that where?
Well, I mean, our 2019 study was pretty much in the same category, but yeah, more extreme, obviously. But yeah, there's a lot out there on that.
Yeah, I saw studies that our monoamine oxidase inhibitors, our endogenous ones, are upregulated during stress as well. So that's what I'm saying. It just needs to be under like one umbrella, one study, kind of just pushed out comprehensively, because right now it's kind of bits and pieces everywhere, and we just gotta, put them all together. Yeah,
the endo DMT potentially being involved in mood, et cetera, just like serotonin. I think that's another potential role for it, especially like some of the studies that have shown microdosing in rats is, so rodent models for depression are a little, it's a little tough to translate that to humans, in my opinion. But nonetheless, like depressive behaviors in rats can be overturned with sub-psychedelic doses of DMT.
DMT microdoses.
Yeah, which is like, well, maybe baseline levels of DMT fluctuating in your brain are involved in certain things like depression or anxiety, et cetera. So I think that's another potentially interesting.
If Wim Hof method is increasing baseline levels to equivalent, low level DMT, increases, this could be why, people who are practitioners show the benefits to mood from breathwork practice as well, right? That could be one of the mechanisms at play.
Could be a piece of it.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that we're kind of setting up for later on this year is actually an Alzheimer's study with Wim Hof method, because Alzheimer's, they suffer from anxiety and depression and a lack of neurogenesis, a lack of neuroplasticity, and if Wim Hof method upregulates the endogenous system, there's a possibility that it addresses some of the aspects of Alzheimer's. So I'm really excited for something like that to really present some of this concepts of DMT in a very functional, grounded way to help the population. I think we're going to see some interesting results.
Yeah, I read that study, the Wim PNAS study the other day. Finally got some time to check that out. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, excuse me, with the link to hypoxia. Mm-hmm. And DMT has been shown to be anti-inflammatory, and sort of all that immune stuff kind of goes hand in hand with inflammation, right?
Yeah, and Wim Hof method is a controlled hypoxia, right? It's not just like a chronic hypoxia, because in Alzheimer's or other neurodegenerative diseases, you see chronic hypoxia. And just to be clear, the Wim Hof method with the breathing and then the retention is actually like a controlled hypoxia.
So like the hormetic stress version of hypoxia.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's different.
That's why we need a way to just get a read on it in the human, even if it's not the brain and the plasma or whatever, just a really reproducible technique. And then you can start asking questions like, is it involved in depression? Is it involved, like, does the Wim Hof method have something to, because right now it's just so much scientific speculation, unfortunately. But yeah, that's why I think it's really important to develop a technique that'll be able to image it reliably in humans, mm-hmm. DMT endogenously.
I want to talk about something that we briefly discussed before, and this is Aldous Huxley's theory, and he talks about this in Doors of Perception, maybe elsewhere as well, that the brain is a reducing valve, that it's basically taking in the available abundance of information, and because of our processing capacity and our necessity to focus on a certain limited amount of things to produce an outcome that is beneficial for the human organism to eat and fuck and do whatever the human organism needs to do, that the brain is actually involved in reducing the available amount of information that is out there. And his theory on psychedelics is that psychedelics are opening these Venetian blinds, opening up the blinds to allow more information to come in. And that's actually what we're seeing. So why people think it feels more real is because we're actually getting more data rather than less data, or rather than producing some hallucinogen, for example, that's coming in some weird way. What is the you were talking about some of the research that you're aware of that's kind of in support of this kind of understanding of the brain.
All right. Yeah. I mean, it's just these creative folks are ahead of their time, man, because it is. There's overlap with what's being shown with psychedelic administration in terms of what it does to brain entropy. So I don't understand all of that. That's not exactly my game, but like I get the basic concept of basically you're just creating the analogy I use with the music background is like if you have this like old school synthesizer that has the big patch bay on it, and if you just start taking it and patching it all over the place just randomly, that's kind of what it seems like psychedelics may do to some degree. And then, you hit the button, and sometimes, depending on how it was patched, it'll give you a weird sound. Sometimes it'll give you a chill sound. Sometimes it'll give you no sound at all. So, but point being is like entropy. So psychedelics definitely are increasing the entropy in the brain. There's a metric that a lot of my colleagues at the University of Michigan, my grad student buds, would use to look at it. And it's basically like the same idea as binarizing or compressing MP3. So like the basic like mathematics and physics is that you're taking in these studies, we were looking with EEG signals. So you're taking an EEG electrical signal and you're binarizing it. And then you're saying like based on the peaks and the troughs, you assign like a 1 or a 0. And then you create strings of words out of 1s and 0s. And then the more unique strings of words, after you do a little processing on it, corresponds to higher entropy. And what is found is that things like anesthetics or things like disorders of consciousness like coma will decrease that entropy big time. And as you progress like back to waking, so like waking and REM sleep have the basically the same amount of entropy. And then psychedelics even kick it up a little bit higher than that.
And what exactly is entropy as it relates to the brain?
Right. So, I mean, it's really just, so again, the mathematics I'm not going to try to get into, but it really is just a reflection of, in terms of things like, another metric would be like connectivity, is like brain areas that don't necessarily normally communicate with one another are starting to do that. So it's like breaking down these within network areas communicating with one another and sort of opening up like the whole brain for communication, which is kind of philosophically in my mind, that's sort of my interpretation of the reducing valve from Huxley, right? Because like you said, the brain is basically a system that wants to minimize all that so that it can make sense out of things.
Compartmentalization, whereas this is breaking down the walls of the compartments. And so you're seeing a flood of information and communication amongst different aspects of the brain.
Right. And then, like I was saying, there's other studies where it's called pre-pulse inhibition. So they'll give like 2 generally auditory stimuli to participants. And basically how closely they're presented, like one will mask the other, but when psychedelics are involved, that masking effect goes away. So there's like more information that can get through the system, basically.
Yeah. I think I saw a presentation of maps from Amanda Fielding, and she was talking about the effect of psilocybin in restriction of the default mode network. And I think a lot of this has been shown in a variety of psychedelics. With that understanding, the idea would be that the default mode network is principally involved in the regulation of this information. And when you restrict blood flow to that area, take it, quote, offline, to use a computer term, when you take it more relatively offline, then the reducing valve capacity, the default mode network, which is involved with the amygdala, involved in fear response, involved in danger assessment, and all of these different attributes. When you take that fear response, danger assessment, default mode network, amygdalic processing offline to a certain capacity by restricting blood flow, then the rest of the brain now has the training wheels off. It's like the regulators off the go-kart, and it can travel to, farther and receive information from different dimensional realities that are always around us and available.
Do you know if there's similarities in terms of the default mode network activity in meditation and psychedelics? Like, does meditation quiet it down as well?
Yeah, so there are some overlaps. Yeah, I know that in experienced meditators, anyways, an older study found comparisons with the reductions that like Carhart-Harris and colleagues have shown with default mode downregulation. We're starting to look into that as well with our connectivity studies at UCSD, like the DMN involvement in meditation. Like I said, the overlap of how meditative states and psychedelic states are, the similarity between those two in the brain is something that I think is really exciting, and it looks like we're heading that direction with those types of studies. So that'll be cool.
And the interesting challenge too, though, is that experienced meditators, put that as a subject group. Well, what the fuck does that mean? You sitting there on your cushion thinking about sex, or are you like going somewhere? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Like, it feels like there's a vast discrepancy in aptitude. Like, an experienced basketball player is not LeBron James. You know what I mean? Like, he's not necessarily going to dunk on you and rain threes. It seems like there's different levels.
That's valid.
And so it is an interesting phenomenon, just because of it seems like different people maybe innately have different access points, no matter how much you try. And it's not a knock on anybody for not trying their hardest or anything like that, but it's just human beings we're interesting. We have certain people have innate qualities, certain people who, grown up from an early age, and they see spirits and they see things that are happening in ways that are inexplicable. I mean, I dated a girl in high school that was like that could see spirits from when she was young. She grew up in a religious house. And so they tried to like exorcise it out of her, and eventually she blocked it out. But it was like, this was a fundamental thing. And some of these things told her invaluable information about like a robbery that was about to happen. And she, like all of these like very interesting, like inexplicable phenomenon, right? So like that person it's a human subject, but the fact that humans are just so different, that's another challenge that, fortunately there's people like you out there to help figure that out. But with studying humans, that becomes the difficulty, because a human being is not reduced into equivalency to another human being when it comes to these extrasensory capabilities.
Well, what I'll say in terms of how do you define like experience versus inexperience, one of the things that really blew my mind when I started to research this for my postdoc, meditation, because I didn't have any experience with looking at the brain in meditative states until like 6 months ago, really. But was that we look at it in chronic pain. So basically, now we're looking at it in chronic pain, but prior to that, there were studies where in healthy subjects, healthy individuals, they would come in and they would get like a heat stimulus on their calf. And after only like 4 training sessions of like a mindfulness-based meditation training, so across like 4 weeks, these completely naive people were able to use meditation to significantly reduce pain. So now we're kind of following that up and also looking at like more long-term to see if there's like a dosage effect. So if you have like weeks and weeks and weeks of training, if you'll get better at that. And then one of the other things I thought was pretty cool is when you look at the neural correlates of people that are really like hardcore practitioners that are basically devoted to meditation, that are maybe in monasteries, et cetera, practicing it. When in the participants in these studies that we've had, what you find is you find this activation of these like frontal executive brain areas, and you find a deactivation of something like thalamus, which is like the sensory area, which is basically suggesting like that your cognitive ability to sort of turn off this sensory experience is maybe leading to this pain reduction. But in these really experienced, dedicated practitioners and people meditating, you see the opposite of that. You see this executive downshift, and you see like the sensory upshift in thalamus, suggesting that they're just sitting there with their sensory experience. So it's pretty cool. Like there's some
nuance.
changes. Yeah.
Have you heard of any of those studies studying people with like multiple personalities, and then different personalities have different sort of allergies and things like that?
No.
Yeah, Dispenza talks about that a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, there's one in particular that's it's a published case study of there's an individual, I believe he had 13 different personalities. And one of his personalities in particular was horribly allergic to orange juice. But there was another one of his personalities that loved orange juice. So it would put him in this dilemma. Whereas if the personality that loved orange juice was drinking the orange juice, he was fine. But if he switched into the other personality while he was drinking orange juice, aware of the fact that he was drinking orange juice, he would break out in hives.
That is so wild.
And this is, you guys can look it up. It's a published case study on this. And this is the foundation of, Joe Dispenza's work, saying like, this is what the brain is capable of, and all of the different placebo studies. But to understand that when you have just different beliefs and different thoughts, you can change something that people would think of as, just a biological event. There's allergens that you're sensitive to in your body, and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, maybe not. Maybe, and again, maybe we're all just perspectives in the mind of God. And when we shift our perspective and our beliefs and our identity, we can shift all of the matter and material that's there.
Yeah.
That seems to be, what this might be potentially suggesting as a hypothesis.
Yeah, I mentioned cluster of studies on Ben Stewart. I was on Ben Stewart's podcast recently, and I cited studies from the 70s in which
I better get an invite to that fucking podcast.
you better, man.
Ben, if you're listening.
There's actually, I think, 7 studies in which adult women were placed under hypnosis. So obviously an altered state of consciousness, maybe sedation. Some people like have a certain perspective of hypnosis that it's not real, but it's real, and it's more of like, it's similar to meditation, not exactly the same.
I gotta have somebody hypnotize me because I'm one of those people that I'm like,
skeptical of that?
I just don't know. I just don't think it could work on me. But that's like my potentially like rampant hubris and overconfidence and like the stalwart nature of my brain. Like,
I think it's probably the opposite, because you seem like an intelligent person, and in a sense that hypnosis has actually been, at least from the studies that I've seen, there's a correlation between elevated intelligence and hypnotic ability.
I see you trying to honey dick me into changing my position here, John, and it's working. Carry on.
Saying, listen, man. Well, I got to cite the studies that we're going back to the mind molding reality, and there's actually, I think, 7 studies regarding women placed under hypnosis, adult women. And they were the instructions were to visualize like a warm towel on their breasts, and to visualize their breasts actually and getting larger. And these studies would take place over 12 weeks.
You just hypnotized all men listening to the podcast.
Yeah, listen up.
Visualize
this is
the
important.
same thing.
Well, this is extremely important because the implications are huge. No pun intended. For Christ, I didn't even try to do that. But anyway, so there was a case study in the late 60s that showed that there was actually breast growth from being under hypnosis and visualizing the breasts enlarging, and there was subsequent follow-up studies that proved this. And then the scientists would see, other variables of, would hypnosis alone induce increases in breast size? No, it correlated with the visualization. And it goes along with concepts like Rupert Sheldrake morphogenetic field, in which maybe in altered states, our visualizations design an imprint, and then the body will go ahead and follow that imprint. And the researchers found that the breast growth actually stayed after months. So after 12 weeks of doing the visualization and hypnosis once a week for an hour, it was almost like a permanent change in the physical body of these adult women.
There was a study done in, I think it was France, on French subjects, and I talk about this in my book, Own the Day, and they had them visualize themselves doing bicep curls, and they visualized themselves doing bicep curls, and then they measured the growth of the bicep muscle, and there was like statistically significant growth. Then they had them visualize lifting even heavier weights with their biceps, and there was even higher growth in muscle genesis without doing any other activities, all other factors accounted for. And it's really interesting, that just visualizing themselves lifting weights like that, and then visualizing themselves lifting heavier weights, had a correlative increase in what was capable. So, what is possible?
What is reality? I mean, the implications for health, right, are extremely profound.
Who says the patriarchy is all bad?
I'm just saying, right, the implications are huge. Let's say somebody has, unfortunately, pancreatic cancer. Can they visualize that going away, right? Can you get in an altered state for prolonged periods of time and have a distinct effect on your physiology? I think that
I'm skeptical of that one.
Skeptical of what?
Just
Which one?
The whole visualization going away thing.
Listen, when
you get into dangerous territory with that, though, because you're going to get people
crazy.
Like,
I know. Obviously,
I'm going to visualize my cancer disappearing.
Well, listen, there are studies showing that.
I'm not talking complete. I'm not throwing complete
shade. He was very
shade.
comfortable with visualizing your dick getting bigger or your tits growing. But visualizing
not cancer,
like,
man.
Stop right there.
Cancer's permanent.
Stop right there.
No, but remember
as he saunters out of the room with his 17-inch visually enhanced cock. He's like, just hold it right there, John.
Well, you were at my apartment when I had you do that visualization of your hand getting warm, right?
Yeah.
And that did happen.
That's
what I'm saying.
That.
We do these things incrementally, where it's like, if you can warm your hand, can you make your hand cold? Like, how variable is it? And like, there are studies indicating that different temperatures surrounding cancerous cells has an effect on them. So, we're trying to make this as grounded as possible, not trying to go too deep into the woo-woo, but you've interviewed Dispenza, his
I've been
work.
to his summit too, and there's
Yeah.
you'll hear people who testify from their heart or in small groups. I was in small group breakouts, and there's 2-3 people who had cured incurable level stage 4 cancer, this or that. And I understand where you're also where you're coming from as well. Like, this is not something that it's tricky, right? Like, because you don't want to have this just purely positive thinking. I'm going to positive think this away, and I'm not even going to do anything else, and it's just going to be okay. Because Dispenza's method is not that. It's a very deep and involved. And when they talk about it, like, to actually go there, to actually give this a run, it's quite a process. And but that said, whatever, if anybody's listening knows people, I encourage you to look at Dispenza's work and also look at the emergent work on what Travis Christofferson's done on ketogenic diets and cancer. And there's a lot of different ways to look at how to look at these different things that are these maladies that are happening. And I think a combination of all of them might be the way. Like, all right, ketogenesis plus, limited targeted chemo plus Dispenza method. Okay, what happens if you stack all of these different things? And so that's something that I would just be really curious about. And that book from Travis Christofferson, for anybody interested, is called Tripping Over the Truth. It was actually so powerful. I did a book review on aubreymarcus.com/cancer. So if anybody's interested in that research, please check it out, because it's extremely potent. And I think it is important to know, like, all right, let's just open this field up for the full conversation of all of the tools that are possible.
Yeah.
From metabolic modulation to the, advances in, science and those different technologies to the technologies of the mind.
I mean, to be fair, I do see it every day now, with working with the meditation for pain. And people start meditating and their pain goes away or goes down at least, and the brain changes. So like mind over matter is a real thing. So,
yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of cases, at least, anecdotes of people taking ayahuasca and having remission. And, my perspective is that it's, if you make distinct changes to the brain, most likely you're making distinct changes to your central nervous system and your autonomic signaling. So, I mean, it's not that far-fetched to me. Obviously, I'm not a scientist. I'm just a random person. But I think that, that's the foundation of at least the way you can present it to the world in a palatable manner, where you're kind of taking the woo a little bit out of it and trying to make it as grounded as possible.
Well, it's like Dennis McKenna says, we are chemicals, right?
Yeah.
So it's like,
and electricity.
If you are able to modulate a certain chemical process in your body that would have some, or even just like a process like inflammation, et cetera, that would have some grounding in how a pharmaceutical would work to treat a malady, then you just to me that's a logical link.
To me, it goes. I've been trying to write a book called Master Your Mind, Master Your Life, as my follow-up to Own the Day, Own Your Life. And it's been the most difficult thing I've ever done, period, because trying to find the bounds of what is the mind and what is not the mind, so that you could try and be the thing that is mastering the other thing, because the subject-object separation of this is mind and this is not mind, it was so slippery and impossible that all the maps I built ultimately ended up doubling back on themselves. And I've scrapped 60,000 words more times in this book than anything else. And ultimately what I arrived at is the way to build the functional map is to build the map as everything is mind, which is some place that I originally started, that we're a perspective in the universal mind, and our mind is connected to all things. Breaking it out, the somatic mind, instead of this mind, body, spirit. Okay, no. This is your somatic mind. It has some atoms, and it has neurochemicals, and it has structures and chemicals and things. Then there's the story mind, the story about our identity, what Freud would call the ego, and the story of, the superego or the judge, what I call the coach. That's your story mind. And it creates all the stories and helps us navigate through story. And then there's the source mind. And the source mind is connected to all things through the source from which it came and the field which interconnects all of these different things. So it's just 3 different wings of the same mind. Instead of mind, body, spirit, it's somatic mind, story mind, source mind. And whether that's true or not, true in quotation or accurate from whatever psychological perspective, it has been the absolute only way that I could explain my own phenomenon or actually try to carve out a map. So I think it is important to at least entertain that hypothesis that we're the mind is so much more than we think it is. And so the ability of the mind to influence matter, of course, it's just a different part of the mind. The ability for these experiences to external things in fields amongst people and potentially source energy itself, if something you're talking about, 5-MeO, to impact all of the other things from story to body, of course, because it's all mind, So it's not like there's these brick walls built up. There's just different compartments that have different rules of modulation and different rules of interaction, but everything is mind ultimately.
Yeah, it almost seems like you got to get. It almost seems like you got to get out of your mind.
Look up in the sky at night, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it almost seems to me like you have to get out of your mind, quote unquote, to tap into mind, to the power of the mind, right? Because you can't just
out of a certain section of what you would call the mind, and this is the trap, right? You have to get out of the story mind that has a story that this is who you are and this is who you aren't. I'm Aubrey, you're John 1, you're John 2. That's a fucking story.
Yeah.
And if you can get out of that story, there's another story that can be told. And within that other story, what's possible within that story?
Yeah, and that's part of the psychedelic conversation, right? Is getting out of your basic story.
Right.
So
totally.
That's the intriguing aspect of it all.
That's like the super spoiler alert for my book, which hopefully will eventually be available in 2022. But so if anybody's interested, keep a lookout for that as it comes. But it's been and I think I wouldn't have had any chance at this if it wasn't for my own experiences with all of these different compounds. Like people ask me, who do you think you would have been if without psychedelics? I'm like, I don't fucking know. Like, it's so integral. It's been 22 years since my first psychedelic journey, my vision quest out in the mountains north of Santa Fe. Like, who would I have been? Wow, that's a fucking impossible question. Like, it's like asking who would I have been if I had different parents? Like, I don't know. Like, how are you gonna answer that? It's been a fundamental guide for me for my whole life, and just grateful that they exist, and now grateful that we're at the precipice of this revolution where the access points and the information and the research is opened up. I mean, the fact that I just talked to Anton Bilton and he's able to intravenously inject people with DMT to measure whether there's entities are real or not. Like, that wasn't the scientific reality in the late 80s,
Well, it takes these rogue, financiers to really fund these sort of studies. And I think that's the exciting part of being in this era, that you have so much money on the sidelines. Everybody's looking to put it somewhere interesting. And I think everything that we've been talking about thus far, from the phantom limb to the entities to even like things like your darkroom retreat, I think all these things need to be funded more. And I think there needs to be more media content around them to, alert people that these things are actually happening.
And just the narrative changing too about, like, since everything is illegal at a federal level, like the number of highly intelligent and high contributions to society, like doing good things for community, etc. Like psychedelics, like as promoting empathy and compassion, right? Like that's something we're very interested in at UCSD. And I mean, there's some studies that have shown clearly that anybody who's participated or ingested a psychedelic compound knows that it does open you up to the perspective of you are not this individual, right? There's this like collective community of people, and whatever you do impacts other people. So like, let's just try to be a little more chill with each other.
Yeah, exactly.
And the fact that we have conversations now that people who aren't as afraid to openly discuss their experiences with these substances, compounds. I always use these science words, man, for these. Psychedelics is the right word.
It seems to me that we're all stuck in the story mind, and the story mind is very sociopathic. It's you compared to everybody else, and you trying to get ahead and be better than everybody else in some way. This is the classic aspect of the ego, or what I call the player, the one with the jersey and the stat sheet and all of the thing, trying to maximize contracts and figure it out and dominate. as much as you can. And if you can get away with it when the ref's not looking, you fucking get away with it. Why? Because you're trying to fucking win. That's why. If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. Tito Ortiz, like this is the idea. This is the way that it is. And if you can get away with shitting on the environment, but there's nobody else to look at you, yeah, fuck it. It's going to increase profits. Like that's the only thing. We're locked in this story mind perspective of this bad story and this very egoic, concept. And when you take these compounds, it actually connects you to both the source mind and the somatic mind. So your body starts talking to you like, hey man, all that stress and all this stuff you've been putting in me is not so good. Like we need to chill on that, purge, you'd have different ideas about your consumption patterns and your life patterns. And then also to the source mind, like, wow, I don't think I'm actually that different than the sea that I'm plundering or the rainforest that I'm burning or the people that I'm shitting on. And you start to, it just changes the way and kind of rebalances the psyche so that you're not dominant in one aspect. And I think that's what needs to happen more than anything else, is just breaking us free from this, unnecessary weighted average of people being in this kind of egocentric story mind.
Totally.
Yeah, completely agreed. One of the interesting things that was brought up to me in a podcast I did last year was that, some of the people in Silicon Valley, where I'm from, they don't necessarily go for the breakthrough dose where, the ego is kind of shattered and then they connect with the greater vision of the whole world. It's like they're taking microdoses or low doses, and it's actually helped them being better capitalists. And that was kind of an interesting concept that was brought to my attention, because I was like, that's kind of scary in the sense of, utilizing psychedelics to enhance your cognitive abilities to actually be a better capitalist. What do you think about that?
I think it's kind of scary, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, everything can be used for that. I mean, look at what Moctezuma's priests were doing at the peak when they were sacrificing people at the top of the pyramid, right? They were high on mushrooms, teotihuacán, high on psilocybin mushrooms, so that they could pull people's hearts out with their obsidian knife and feed it through the mouth of Huitzilopochtli and kick them down the curb of the fucking steps for 10 hours in a row without getting tired because they're on mushrooms, right? Like, so don't think that these things are going to make you good. It doesn't get as much more bad as that. You know what I mean? Like on a fucking heart-ripping assembly line. Like you're
set and setting. They just needed a nice fluffy rug at the mountain base.
Yeah, for sure. Sure. That was the opposite set and setting. Created like methed out Kano from Mortal Kombat. Which some people will get that reference because the Mortal Kombat movie came out, but I was an old school game player. I knew how to do that fatality. Don't remember anymore.
Man, you want to speak a little bit about your darkroom experience? I mean, I think that's pretty intriguing, especially in light of the endo-DMT.
Yeah, so I reached out to you about that and was talking to you about that, and I think this is something, I'm working on a documentary about it, and we're trying to get some answers, because around day 3, and this was something that everybody was describing and talking about. And again, I was skeptical. I'm always skeptical till I experience something, which is why I'm skeptical of hypnosis, because I haven't experienced it. Not that I don't believe it. I want to know it for myself. So everybody's saying, oh, it's like you have this DMT, endogenous DMT experience, and it's blah, blah, blah. I was like, yeah. I've done a lot of DMT. We'll see. And then day 3, I start seeing these pulsing lights coming in. I mean, you're in absolute pitch dark. And these lights start pulsing. And you know how there's this kind of, when that chrysanthemum hits in a DMT journey, there's sometimes like a sound associated with it in a slight way, like it's like this buzzing of the ears or in this weird way. There's like a little bit of that too. So it was a slight auditory, but more visual than anything. And that's how it came on. And then eventually by the next day, it popped me through to a full, what I would describe as like the twilight of an ayahuasca journey or the twilight of a DMT journey, not peak. I never reached peak, like the peak concentrations that I would experience in a exogenous DMT experience, but it stayed for 3 days. I had visions of my father. I had visions of Buddha. I had visions of different people's souls I could interact with and talk to. I was in constant immersion with the, non-physical dimensions. And also when I would eat food, like I would have it was a raw vegan was the diet that we're eating. So I'd eat a piece of broccoli, and then the broccoli would just sprout into my mind in like full 3D, like crystal clear HD vision, which is the only time I've ever had an experience like that visually was on Iboga, interestingly. Like usually they're a little fuzzy, I could imagine seeing broccoli, but it would, in a normal like psilocybin or DMT journey, the broccoli would be like, I know it's broccoli, but it's not like I can see with perfect crystal clear detail every different sprout and every piece of the stalk. But on that, for whatever reason, I could. So it was very interesting experience, and obviously very emotional, and there's a lot of processes that are going on. So
Is that part of, I'm pretty understudied on indigenous techniques, and unfortunately, but is that part of like some shamanic rituals to have dark retreats as a big portion? Okay.
Yeah, and different cultures have had it. I think the Kogi people had, initiates stay for long periods of their youth in caves before emerging into reality, so that they actually spent their formative years with neuroplasticity at the highest levels, right? The ability to learn and the ability to understand, that was spent under constant elevated levels of endogenous DMT in these experiences. So when they emerged, they were emerged with greater knowledge of the non-physical and visual world than they were of the visual world. And that's what made them the medicine keepers.
What was your sleep like? I mean, so could you distinguish like dreams from waking visions?
Yeah.
Did you dream still?
I can't recall any dreams. So sleep was really good. I think the first night maybe I did. Sleep was really good for night 1. Night 2, it felt okay. I felt like I got a good amount of sleep. But then once the flashing lights hit on day 3, and I had my Oura ring on, so I was actually able to measure and see. I think I slept 10 hours the first day, which is great for me. That's like, I'm usually like a 6-hour kind of guy. And then like, it was on down to like 7 the night 2. And then by night 3, I was at 4, and then trailing down ever since then, 4, 3, 2. And I stayed at around 2 hours of really awful sleep. Like the scores that I was getting on my Oura ring were like 20, like for anybody who has a ring, it's pathetic.
Did you feel super run down after that, or because you're in the dark, you still felt okay? Or?
I mean, yes, it's energetic. It was energetically toxic. I felt like at a certain point I would have regulated, like I would have just had to have slept, but I kind of stayed in just long enough that I didn't get over the hump. I think there would have been a hump to get over, but it was, and also it's so emotional. I mean, I was like crying and feeling anger come up and all these different emotions that were going. So it was exhausting, but there was something about also that active amount of DMT that was energizing as well. Like there was this, in some way it was restorative to maybe my mood, maybe to some other different aspects. So it wasn't like I feel like I get one night of 3 hours of sleep and I'm in way worse shape than I got after 4 nights there. And I think it probably has to do with, what was happening in my brain.
Have you done this multiple times or just the one time?
Just one time. Huh. But I made a dark room up in my house. It's not quite good enough yet though, because like it's hard. It's a technology to get a room completely dark because you need a complete absolute darkness, and light tries to come in everywhere.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to get my own house dark room set up, but unfortunately the person who's working on it is in California, so every time something breaks in my dark room, I'd have to wait. So we're going to solve that problem though. I feel like I have the ingenuity resources to solve the problem. And yeah, I intend to do another one and dive back in and see.
It would be really interesting to get a grip on DMT levels throughout that, because
how would you even test that?
You would have to do it in plasma for something like that,
Okay.
I would think.
What is there any other studies like correlated with that? Have you come across anything in terms of prolonged darkness?
So I don't. That's a GMO question. I don't know that literature as much. That shit gets confusing really fast. That circadian research. I've been involved with a little bit of it, but just from what is in my wheelhouse, the neurochemical stuff. The studies are kind of splotchy, and I think there was some in humans, and they measured melatonin. I believe in urine, but it could have been blood too. But anyways, and then there were like sheep studies that they were able to. It's you could dive in a little more because you don't have to worry about a human being in darkness for that long or whatnot. But my interpretation of them was that, so let me back up. So we know that just in a normal night of sleep, when you are about to go to sleep, like so the darkness will generally cue, like there's a small nuclei like your hypothalamus that just has like a couple tens of thousands of neurons in it, and in the absence of the light, it basically triggers like a norepinephrine release onto the pineal, and then the pineal will it'll give you this serotonin spike, and then the precursor for serotonin and melatonin is actually the precursor for DMT too, tryptophan, dietary tryptophan. The turkey compound that everyone knows it as.
So what you're saying is we need a turkey diet while we're in the darkness.
Right. #gobble. So in a normal night of sleep, that's what'll happen, and you'll get
gobbling.
Yeah, and you'll get yeah, you're the marketing guru. I'm just look at me, right? So you'll get this spike in serotonin, and then it goes down. And this was done the same way that we measured for DMT. A lot of these studies are microdialysis, so there's like a probe in the rat brain, and you can actually sample this in real time. And you get these real consistent peaks for like the serotonin going up, and then it comes down, and it's pretty much indicative of tryptophan, then serotonin going from tryptophan all the way to the melatonin pathway. So in the literature that I've seen for the constant darkness, it seems like at the beginning of it, you get this really big increase in melatonin, and then it sort of stabilizes. And then there are some studies, I believe, where it's shown that it like steeply drops. The latter is more interesting to me if that would pan out to be the case, is because it could be indicative of like tryptophan being shunted from a melatonin pathway to a DMT pathway. So the physiology is kind of like there for like the experiential stuff you're describing. Again, so much of this is like speculative at this point from the science perspective, just because we don't even know what the hell DMT is doing like normally.
Yeah.
But having it be involved in like a circadian rhythm, like these are all like valid hypotheses, and it's scientific speculation. So it would be cool to see some people dive into that. But plasma, I think, is how you would have to do that one, at least if you were doing like a human study. You could just like have a rat that you monitor the DMT in real time across the whole. We did that sort of, but the study in the 2019 study, it really wasn't designed. Like our sampling rate was like every 15 to 30 minutes. And REM sleep in a rat is like a minute or two. So you just miss it.
Yeah.
And so we saw those really nice circadian phase curves, like I was saying, but the DMT, when we looked, it was just kind of like spotty all over the place.
It's an interesting world, we got to wrap this up, but one of the problems with our world is that it's been oriented towards capitalism, towards money. What's going to make the most money? What drugs are going to make the most money to treat versus, other treatment methods that aren't going to earn enough money that you can't galvanize. Like, that's been a challenge. And now that psychedelics are available into the capitalistic sphere, I think we're going to see a flood of science that's going to come out. Of course, the intention is that ultimately the science turns into capitalism, and that's what actually allows the funding to flow through. And so whatever criticism of the mechanism is in favor of a rapid increase of research right now, because I see it happening. I get this, different Imperial College here, Beckley here, this is so-and-so here, all of these different places are like, yeah, let's research this shit, because now there's some real opportunities that are coming up. So that's, I think, it's an exciting time, not just for, human health, mental health, exploration of consciousness, but also for just our understanding and from a scientific perspective about what's going on. Because I think fast forward, 2 years from legalization, and there's going to be a lot of fucking papers, and that's going to be an exciting time. So I appreciate both of you guys' contribution to the field and to my understanding and the world's understanding of what's going on here.
Yeah, it's been a great talk. Thanks for having us, man.
Yeah, right on, man. Yeah, look out for the second episode of DMT Quest coming out later this year. It's going to be a good one.
What's a little preview? What are we gonna see?
We're gonna build upon the first episode, and we're gonna delve into Dean's vision for his non-invasive measurement of endogenous DMT. We're gonna be delving into maybe blood plasma technology to measure fluctuations in the blood of humans and DMT. So that's like a little snippet of what's going to be going on, and obviously we're going to be tying in a lot of details in regards to the importance of the gamma wave and functionality within the brain. So should be fun.
Beautiful. Well, and for anybody who hasn't seen it, check out DMT Quest as well. Is it still on YouTube?
Yeah, still on YouTube, still for free, no ads. So just check it out, share it out, and let's spread the word.
Yep. Beautiful. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and thanks for the Fit for Service Academy for watching live. Thanks for checking out this video. For more like it, please subscribe to my channel. And of course, the Aubrey Marcus podcast with new episodes every single week. And follow me on Instagram @Aubrey Marcus. Thank you so much.